Hello, check. Hello, testing.
We're just in the process of starting in a minute or two for those who are online, and folks are just getting their coffee. Uh, oh, sorry. We had, I mean, so rather than five other people, there's five other people in the morning.
Testing 1, 2.
So if I could request folks to come on in, please. Uh, Gagan? Yeah. Yeah, I, yeah. So there's seats in the front. This is turning like my lecture halls. All my students run to the back. So, welcome everyone. And if I could request my panelists to join me, uh, I won't have the ability to do justice to their backgrounds. We have joining us Kanika Chawla, who's a lead at CEEW, Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, who's been not just a researcher, but also spends extensive time working with ISA, International Solar Alliance, and a number of other stakeholders and people in this domain. We also have, all the way joining us from Australia, someone who knows and works also on India, Tim Buckley from director at AIFA. Sorry, how do you pronounce the institute? AIFA, and Gagan Sidhu, who it's my pleasure to re-invite. We've had him at a panel discussion almost a year ago now, last November. Gagan was formerly the CFO of GMR, and is an independent consultant and also a prolific author in this space. So interested in the finance, but also the higher RE. And I'm Rahul Tongia, a scholar leading the energy and sustainability group at Brookings, India, and delighted a number of you are able to join this discussion on renewable energy, also known as RE, in India. And RE is in some ways viewed as a subset of this energy transition, but transition then means there's other stuff going on as well. So what does it also mean maybe about alternative energies, alternative meaning non-RE energy sources, let me clarify. And so this is meant to be a free-flowing discussion, hopefully not too much PowerPoint. I will cheat, I will use one slide to really kick off the juices, to kick off the conversation, get the juices flowing. And we have an audience online as well, so hopefully they'll have a chance to engage. But we will not start with the usual question of will India reach its 175 targets on this particular date, because that's in some ways academic. We've just come off a quite successful global event, RE Invest, that a number of us were in the room present at or involved with. And so clearly this momentum is only growing towards renewable energy. It is quite a sea change, I think. If I had to make an oversimplification between the first RE Invest and the second RE Invest, which have a gap between them, they're not annual events. The first one was really about setting the stage. It was a lot of hope. I wouldn't use the word hype, but a lot of forward-looking statements, to use the stock market terminology. And now the second one has really been much more hands-on, nuts and bolts, facing the challenges head-on that have come up, as opposed to just the grand ambitions that are there. And so it's in many ways a much more mature space than it was, much less hope-driven. It's actually reality-driven, but then reality also then means there's all sorts of aspects that have to be discussed, deliberated, and figured out along the way. So with these sorts of high-level questions and thoughts in mind, it's my pleasure and privilege to have panel of experts on this topic. And I'm going to start with just this one question on renewable energy. And when we say renewable, for clarification, we're meaning renewable electricity, mainly wind and solar, just to clarify. And when we look at this, out of India's targets of 175 gigawatts, 160 being wind and solar by 2022, one of the questions that some scholars have now been asking is, are these targets really all the end game that's there? How do we actually go to much, much more? Because if the world is talking about less than 1.5 or 2 degrees, forget 2, but ideally less than 1.5, it's deep decarbonizing that the world is chasing. And 175 gigawatts of RE is not going to get us to deep decarbonizing. It's going to be much, much more. Now the dual, or the flip side of this, is really asking, is 175 gigawatts the low-hanging fruit only? And let me clarify what that means. So this is sort of the first question out to folks. Can we just show one side? So this is a graphic from a brand new, today released policy brief that's on our website, Brookings India. The title is RE versus coal, a false framing, because both are going to be there. And if you think about how renewable energy is spoken about in lay press, it's often two curves intersecting, one downward sloping, one upward sloping. Renewables are getting cheaper, coal is getting more expensive, and they cross over at grid parity. And it's only an academic debate whether that's happened or not happened yet, or is it just a matter of time being the x-axis. We posit that the reality is more going to be like a ladder of competitiveness. And the first rung on this ladder, which is mainly this 175 that's being talked about, first few rungs, is the lower hanging fruit, which means your total, if you reach the 175 target by 2022, assuming demand of electricity grows at some median rates, you're talking in the range of 19% of your electricity by 2022 to come from renewables, which today is in the order of 8%. Did I get these numbers roughly right? So, share of generation, correct. Not capacity, but kilowatt hours from RE. So it's obviously a very high jump in a growing market, so it's remarkable. But at the same time, that's a low enough number that it can be absorbed relatively easily into the grid with some amount of effort in planning, coordination, transmission enhancement, and so forth. But it doesn't require storage yet. So the first ladder is, should I build a new coal plant or should I build new RE? And the numbers seem to say it's a no-brainer. Don't build a brand new coal plant. RE is cheaper, and you're comparing the levelized cost of energy of RE and coal. It's easy. The next rung actually says, should I operate my existing coal plant? It's already built. Someone's paying for it or paid for, versus build new RE. This is with a narrow economic lens. We're not talking externalities yet in this discussion. Here, you end up comparing the levelized cost of energy of renewables versus the marginal variable or fuel costs of coal. And that is something where you get different answers based on who you talk to, where you are. And location turns out to be a very key differentiator because, and we have some studies on this, there's a major report on our Brookings website on transportation, railways, and coal, that there's a high cost of railways to delivered price of coal. In fact, it dominates the cost for far enough locations. And so do I not run an existing coal plant? Well, that may be the case in far off locations, which is the double whammy for railways. Or if you're pithead, then coal is actually not that expensive, relatively speaking, at the margin. And these are both variable RE or VRE. No storage required, take it when you can. The problem is that gets strongly linked to the total CUF. The capacity utilization factor may be about 20% for solar, for example, a little higher for wind. And it does not meet your evening peak, especially from solar, unless you have storage. Most of the time, the Indian grid has a peak demand in the evening. Not all the time, but much of the time. And so therefore, solar is not contributing to the peak. And what is India's sort of swing production? It's coal. In the US, it's been gas. There have been other fuels in other countries. In India, your swing producer has been coal. Hydro is actually a highly variable one, but hydro's capacity is not growing as fast. So even though it's very capable of ramping, it doesn't quite qualify for long-run growth. So now once you add storage, you have to look at the blended weighted cost levelized of battery plus RE. So then you have the same two rungs adding increasing amounts of storage, such as batteries. So the next rung is now, do I build battery plus RE or do I build coal if I'm trying to worry about my non-daytime demand, including the peak? That's a harder question for the economics of RE. And then the last rung, which is the hardest, is when you're going to say, I want to displace an existing coal plant base load at the margin. So now I'm comparing the levelized cost of storage plus RE with the variable cost of coal, which of course is location specific or dependent. So this seems to be a trajectory that's out there. And so now the open sort of questions is, where does 175 fit? Are we going to even need storage? If not 175 or if not 2022, you can slice and dice it. At some point, will you need storage, or what else is really driving the comparative economics of solar, RE and coal? Because RE and coal is much of the conversation in India. Just one sort of framing for opening. So all folks, I think, have a mic, so it's free to Janet.
Hello. So, Rahul, if I may, I think at the outset, one of the things that I do want to sort of mention is that while the discussion today is going to be electricity.
Can you check if it's on? Sorry.
Hello. Yeah. So, well, one of the things that is going to be talked about is electricity. When we look at global warming, and when we look at emissions, and when we look at the share of electricity, emissions in India, it's only about 40%. So it's well and good to talk about renewable generation of electricity. But the moment you bring in emissions and global warming into the context, you can't escape the fact that agriculture, transportation, and industry also contribute a lot to emissions in India. And the narrative around renewable generation, while it's of electricity, revolves around solar PV and wind. And there are technologies out there in agriculture, in industry, which actually allow you to mitigate emissions.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of an opening statement comment on that. We'll focus on the electricity bit, but we can't sort of ignore the non-electricity emission bit.
So, since I hope we can keep this interactive, agreeing with you vehemently, in that sense, is there a risk of distortion where so much emphasis has been placed on the supply side and not enough on energy efficiency or alternatives or different segments that don't use? Because just adding more solar capacity, if that's the answer, then I keep asking, what's the question? Because the question really is, if my objective function is lower emissions, then worldwide there's a number of studies that have shown it's not necessarily the cost optimal route or the only route to say increase your supply, your capacity of RE. So are we at that point where there is that distortion? Sorry, can you just tap if it's... No, if you press the on button at the bottom.
Okay, yeah. Technology and I are not friends, clearly. So what I was saying is that the objective function is actually not just lower emissions. And domestic targets are not at all driven by that objective function. It's all very nice because it feeds in very nicely with our climate commitments, etc. But this energy transition that we're seeing, and in my view, India is well and truly on its way in an energy transition, is driven very much by domestic factors like energy poverty and overcoming that, energy security and reducing our reliance on imports, even though in some ways we are first increasing it before decreasing it. And also like good economics. What is the cheapest source of electricity? How do you do it? And cheapest source not just per unit of not by electron, but also system-wide. So do you then do more DRE, etc.? What creates local jobs? And then do you mitigate climate change? Right? So I would sort of order it in that way. And having said that, I think that those were all the drivers when we came up with the 175, which in my view is very much the floor, not the ceiling. Even our NDC would suggest that we're going to actually have to go in the sort of 300
but that's by 2030.
Scale. Right, it is. And it's also non-fossil, which really I don't understand. It's not like we're ramping up nuclear, hopefully. So we should just say 40% renewables. But having said all of that, I think at some point between forming this top-level target and where we are at now, we've lost sight of some of the trade-offs, and we're now making some policies that are at cross purposes with each other.
Can you elaborate a little on that?
Wow, I'm really going to lose my job and then my citizenship. Well, one of the things is, do we want to make cheap electricity so that we can make just about anything in India, or do we want to make solar panels in India?
So you're talking about the safeguard duty?
Yes, absolutely. The second one is, do we want to have more jobs in the renewable energy sector? In which case we need to do much more distributed renewables, just because the employment factor is 17 times as much as if you do solar parks per megawatt. Or do we want to again make cheap electricity and then create more industry, right? And then you can go either way, but you have to have consistent policy, and there has to be coherence also across ministries and things like that. And that strategy seems to be absent. Um, Other sort of such things of, do we want to have more domestic lending to renewables, and do we want to somehow sort of tip the scales of how the power sector lending has happened, in which case some of the old exposures to existing power projects and transmission, etc., need to be decoupled from renewables as per the RBI norms? Or do we want to rely on foreign capital? And in each of these trade-offs, I don't think one is better than the other. They're just not the same, and we seem to be making policy decisions on both sides of each spectrum.
I mean, that's a challenge, because when the answer used to be all of the above, let's see what happens, then maybe none of it really happens. Absolutely. So, Tim, in addition to some opening thoughts on this, it would also be interesting. I mean, India is not the only country in the world going through an energy transition of different shapes and forms. So maybe some global perspective also.
Okay, thanks.
So you have to hold it closer.
Yep. So maybe two opening comments. One, I would hate to have a fight with a solar producer if I was a coal company. You know you're going to lose. Right? That's my opening premise. You have no chance. Why go into a fight against someone who has a zero variable cost of production? You will lose categorically. Unless you can tilt the regulatory framework dramatically in your favour, in other words, the incumbency issue, you can drag the chain, you can delay the inevitable, but you are going to lose. That's why I do my job. I look at trying to motivate financiers. They don't like going into fair fights. They like fights they're going to win. So if you're putting a proposition up there which looks good, but I do have issues with it, and one of them is it's not a fair fight. Solar is going to win. Wind is going to win. It has zero variable cost. So once it's built, solar and wind are always going to win the fight. So therefore, my second premise is your baseload comment up there. Baseload is a wrong phrase. It's a phrase from 10 years ago. It's certainly the way a coal company likes to describe the market. They talk about baseload and peak, but they also talk about an industry of 10 years ago. And that industry is gone because of my first point. How do you fight in a fight where you've got a high variable cost and you're fighting against someone with a low variable cost? You will lose. It's like trying to fight with China on solar module manufacturing. You will lose. Anyone. Germany, Australia, America, India. You will lose. It's just a given. You do not fight the Chinese on solar module manufacturing. I don't have to live here, so unlike you, I can actually get away with that comment. Why have a fight you're going to lose? So that's my first point. The second point, just going back, base load. If your starting premise is every time someone builds a solar project, they're going to have a zero marginal cost, therefore they're always going to have priority in any pecking order that's merit-based, therefore your coal-fired power plant is the automatic loser. So baseload is an archaic comment, it's a wrong comment, and it sets the frame of reference wrongly for the technology system that India is moving towards. So I can come back to that, but let me just give you one data point. South Australia, so one small state in Australia, yesterday, 52% of all electricity in the middle of the day, and by the way, peak demand is in the middle of the day, not in the middle of the night, 52% came from rooftop solar. Not from wind, not from utility solar, from rooftop. 52% for the entire 8 hours of the day. Now, there is no coal-fired power plant left in South Australia because they cannot compete. So that's my... When I look at that slide, unfortunately, all of it looks great until I see the word baseload, and then I just think the slide is wrong because baseload doesn't exist. You cannot frame it in that way, otherwise you get the wrong answer.
So I think semantics aside, two sort of observations, because this is the discussion on India's transition. One is India's demand profile, for whatever reason, it may shift over time, is exceptionally flat. The peak is in the evening, but that spread between the evening to other periods is relatively low compared to most other countries that have been compared.
Put in a 500 million air conditioners, that profile will change like every other Western country.
Actually, it would get worse for the evening. So Delhi's experience has been that the peak is often at 10 p.m. because it's residential driven. So this is a billion trillion rupee question, which is it going to be commercial air conditioning or residential air conditioning that's going to go first? And you will get different answers. And I have a nickel for who can sort of help me answer that question.
Sorry.
Back also to the point Gagan was making is also how do you air condition? Do you just move everything to electricity, or do you do district cooling and
Exactly.
sort of, you know,
Building design.
Yeah, and what is the
Or
role of
retrofit,
hydrogen and you
Put
know
in
there's
insulation.
And more than that, I mean,
Sorry, because
sorry.
we're online, we need a
Sorry,
clear
yeah.
pickup.
You know, I wonder how, and again, you know, some people do not like this, but how bad is it if coal suffers, right? It's one thing to say that you're causing an economic loss due to natural disruption. It's another thing to say you are causing a violation of contracts. Now, the latter is pretty bad, but the former, that's the price of advancement, right? I mean,
Creative destruction.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you can't really say that there's an industry, and forget the moral aspect of it, but there's something out there which is not price competitive. I mean, why should it be around? Of course, if it's causing or it's leading to a contractual violation, that's bad. But the former, that's life, right?
So, sorry.
So, maybe, if I may, so your opening comment was the importance of energy efficiency, building efficiency is a critical half of the equation. So
Yep.
to your response that air conditioning needs to be on at 10 o'clock at night, not if you've got a 6-star building.
There's a lot of moving, parts to get there. But two other sort of observations from an Indian perspective. One is, it's not an academic decision, should I build X or should I build Y? We actually literally have too much coal in some ways. You're looking, RBI is talking about stressed assets, and there's backing down. The PLFs of coal plants are down. It is not because of RE, it's because between 2011 and 2017, coal capacity in India, power plants, grew at 12.6% or 12.7%, while electricity demand at grids level, excluding captive, grew at 6.1%. And so you've had a buildup of coal capacity which could operate at the margin. It's not should I build, it's not an academic. You literally have this issue of what do I do? So it'll take some time to work out before we get to the all natural organic fistfight that will happen based on the merit of the technology. The second sort of thing, an observation. Let's assume solar is free. Not quite free, but it's getting there. It's reasonably cheap.
It'll be there in 15 years.
Sure, it'll get much, much cheaper. It'll be not quite cold fusion sort of the future, but saran wrap. You could get flexible printed solar that's as cheap as paper to make, sort of, eventually. What do you do at 8 p.m.? And so if you look at the load curve of India, which we've done in some detail, if your load curve has a certain shape where your noon is a little bit lower on average than your evening, then your capacity factor of solar, if it starts as 20%, ends up saying that anything greater than about 19% CUF has to require storage, because there is no other way you can meet the demand that's outside the solar envelope. So by that sense, when you say it's not a fair fight, solar will win. Solar will win when the sun is shining. And so from a country's planning perspective, as of now, unless you're hitching your horse to the storage wagon, coal becomes your backstop or your default option.
I actually want to add a nuance to both your points, and then maybe I'd let Gagan and Tim do the heavy lifting. So on the first point around stranded or excess coal capacity, right? And this thing of we have excess power, it's not actually that we don't actually have excess power. I find that really, really upsetting. It's just that our utilities are broke. They didn't seem to sort out all of their issues after 3 bailouts. And so we actually have a lot of underserved sectors, a lot of underserved people, even where the grid connectivity is existing. So it's not just that the grid didn't grow fast enough while capacity grew fast, it's also that the utilities don't have the demand, even though end consumer demand does exist.
They're not buying. They're not buying.
And we're completely ignoring this whole captive demand that we have just sitting there in the form of energy poverty, right? So that is to the first point. I'd like to add that. To the second point, Gagan said before, how bad is it if the coal sector loses, right? And that's just disruption and technology disruption. But if 15 years later we're going to have saran wrap solar or BIPV, which is really, really affordable, how bad is it that today's solar technology fails? Are we not in some ways then putting ourselves into a tech trap? Because on the wafer thin margins today, if these plants don't run for 25 years, they're going to be the thermal power plants 15 years down the line. So
that's a great question. I think the answer to that is, that's why I made a distinction between technology and contractual obligations. So, if you have your contractual offtake obligations secure in a PPA today, then by no means should it be possible for that scenario to emerge. And secondly, I think why thermal has failed today is not so much of the contractual obligations. I mean, half the thermal plants don't even have PPAs to begin with, right? The ones that do don't have coal. So, it's in that sort of scenario where you have no PPA or no input, doesn't really pan out for solar. So, it's important to make a distinction between technology overtaking, which is fine, breaking contracts, which is not fine. So I was just talking about the second one.
But then isn't the same going to be said between thermal? If they're saying, well, I have cheaper RE, I don't need more. I mean, this is a identified problem, because if your instrument is a PPA, this is one of those flags. If your instrument is a PPA, then you also lock in and reduce the ability for new entrants. And RE is today's new entrant. Saran wrap, cling film, paper thin, building integrated solar is your new entrant 10 years from now. Are they then going to be at a disadvantage? So this is an issue of market design.
Can I jump in?
Please. Yeah.
So would anyone here suggest that India's electricity demand in 15 years' time is not going to be more than double what it is today? Is anyone talking about it going down? Like in Australia, it's been going down for 10 years. In America, it's been going down. But in India, we're talking, is it going to double or treble? That's the debate. So the idea that we're going to your point exactly, contractual certainty, anyone signs a 25-year PPA on solar today has a contract. As you said, they're not doing it without coal. They're not doing it without a PPA. They're doing it with a PPA. They can't get financial close till they've got the PPA. They also have an inbuilt deflator. So the inbuilt deflator is that every tariff in the renewable sector in India today is fixed in nominal terms, declining in real terms for 25 years. So I would argue those plants aren't ever going to be like a thermal power plant, because what's the profit margin on a solar project? 85%. What's the profit margin on a thermal power plant? Could be 20%, or it could be negative 20. So maybe the promoter on a solar project's not going to get his 18% return on equity. Wouldn't that be a horrible situation? Maybe he only gets 14%, or worst case he gets 10. In a thermal power plant, the promoter loses all of his capital. We're not talking about solar losing their capital, we're talking about a less than brilliant rate of return, but I would also then hypothesize the rate of return is going to come down because inflation's coming down.
And that's okay, because solar is inherently so much less risky than thermal, simply
Correct.
because of those reasons, right? You don't have input cost. You don't have input cost volatility. You don't have execution risk. You have none of those risks. I mean, you just literally have to get up in the morning, wait for the sun to shine. I mean, how risky is that? I mean, how much
Except
more
the
than
pollution.
your cost of... Well, that's the science bit of it. That's sort of figuring out your irradiation. That's a separate risk.
So you need the promoters to actually wear the risk on thermal power plants that they deliver. They were going to get all the upside.
Yeah.
They want to socialise the downside.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it.
may I ask a question actually? I feel like Rahul, I took your job a little bit.
That's a sign of a good panel.
But Gagan, I know you think about finance deeply, right? All of the risks then, barring say technology risk, right? Which is just different. It's not that it doesn't exist for thermal,
Yeah.
but barring that then, is the risk profile of a thermal power plant exactly the same as that of a renewables power plant, just because it's mostly all counterparty, right? And then it depends on, and they have the same counterparty.
So yes, I mean, once you have the same counterparty,
Sorry.
that's the commonality. But input is a big risk, right? Which doesn't exist for solar. Input cost volatility is a big risk. Input security is a big risk. So clearly, once the solar plant is made, the only risk aside, if you put generation if you just park it aside, is counterparty risk. And counterparty risk is two things. One is, will the solar power be off-taken, first of all? And once it's off-taken, will it be paid for? So I think what we've seen in India is PPA contracts getting stronger and stronger over the last 4 or 5 years, both in terms of who is the counterparty signing the PPA, as well as strengthening contractual protections for the developer. And that in itself has been one of the big contributing factors to tariffs falling. As you get more and more confident that the power will be off-taken and it will be paid for once off-taken, then the amount of premium or spread you desire or you want over your cost of debt comes down further and further. And the cost of debt itself is, I mean, forget the hardening interest rate cycle globally, but the spread of base rates that lenders demand has been falling. Has been falling,
But I would actually argue that some of the issues related to the PPA and offtake are actually getting exacerbated as the share of renewables. And so I think that the opening discussion that Rahul, the point you made about share of generation still being so small, but because we're doing sort of large wind parks and solar parks, power is sort of, or electrons are coming on in a lumpy
way.
Yeah. So some of the issues then around offtake, not just one is the payment cycle, but actually getting curtailed or do you run it? In my view, I find that the regulation has not kept pace with deployment on the ground of renewables.
So, I mean, just to sharpen this in a more way, I agree with many of the points made. I mean, certainly risk profiles are different and it's good in many ways. But let's assume the cost is dramatically by every metric, regardless of the market structure design that we talked about. Then isn't this just a market problem, and the market will just say, I need more renewable, please give me some. But yet states are not signing the PPAs. The instruments that you're talking about that guarantee the offtake and the cash flow is the PPA. And yet we don't have clamorings of states. The ones that were highest in RE are the first ones, like Maharashtra and Gujarat and others, that have said, thank you very much, I'm full, you're welcome to do what you want, but I'm not signing the PPA, go off and find your own off-taker. So then, is it that, I mean, this is where that system level issue, whether it was a time of day reason, or whether it was too much with the lumpiness that you were talking about. I mean, if on one side everything I hear is correct, that it's so darn cheap and we've figured out the contracting and it is risky, but why do I need these RPOs, which now in the new amendments to the Electricity Act are literally having a counter called RGOs, Renewable Generation Obligation. So something on the other end tells me if it were all done and if it all were market ready, we wouldn't be needing to have this conversation. So what's the gap?
Well, I think part of it comes back to the market price design. At the moment, you're talking a flat PPA, and we're talking one electron at the middle of the day is worth the same as an electron at 8 o'clock at night. Ultimately, I would look at what Australia's done. We have a time of use pricing market. Now, we have time of use, which means retailers charge a very different price at 8 o'clock at night than they do in midday. Logic. It's cheaper to generate solar and wind in the middle of the day, so therefore the price is low. At 8 o'clock at night, the price is high. The wholesale price, we are actually in Australia moving to a 5-minute interval bidding cycle. 5-minute interval. So the price can go from negative 100 to positive 14,000
Per megawatt hour.
per megawatt hour. So the price goes negative in the middle of the day when we have too much variable renewables, and it goes instantaneously to $14,000 a megawatt hour if the sun disappears for an hour or we have rain for a week. But the reality is that doesn't happen, because as soon as you put in a price of $14,000 a megawatt hour, you're actually incentivizing financial markets to deliver pumped hydro storage. you're incentivizing financial markets to deliver peaking gas, even if you have to use LNG. Peaking gas at $14,000 a megawatt hour only has to operate for 10 hours a year and it's profitable. You're incentivizing lithium-ion batteries. You're incentivizing grid connectivity. You're incentivizing demand response management. So when you have a base price that is time agnostic and demand supply agnostic, you've actually got to reassess the whole pricing environment. In Australia, we've got that. So to me, there actually is other characteristics of the market that will emerge in the next 5 years. It's not how much battery storage are we going to have. That's part of the solution. It's how much pumped hydro are you going to have. How much hydrogen storage are you going to have? Now in Australia, we're pursuing hydrogen storage. Germany is pursuing hydrogen or ammonia storage. Now, all of the studies say ammonia doesn't work, hydrogen doesn't work if you're paying $60 or $80 a megawatt hour. I'll put it on the head. What if you're being paid $100 an hour to use electricity? Prices in Queensland have been going negative every week for the last 12 months because we've now got too much solar. All of a sudden you have negative price signals. People are paid to use electricity when you have too much variable renewable. What a beautiful problem. It's a horrible problem for one player, coal, because coal can't ramp. So coal gets absolutely destroyed in that scenario, and that's exactly the system India needs to adopt.
So if you do the time of day, which is one of N signalings that could enable demand response and a bunch of other instruments, that's exactly counter to the risk mitigation tool called a PPA. And so, is there a pathway to get there? Because we have not only PPAs grandfathered or existing out there. If you look at proposals by the ministry, they actually ask for mandatory PPAs to grow under the new proposed amendments to the Electricity Act. So is it just that you can say the PPAs must reflect time of day? I'm not sure that's appropriate, because you need a market mechanism to discover that true time of day, at which point you're better off with just an electricity market in some ways. But if you do that, which handles one side of the problem, what happens to the risk story that you were sort of...
Well, again, I don't think we've seen the last word in the way PPAs are going to look like for solar. I think, remember that the capacity at super high tariffs, 15 rupees, 17 rupees, 12 rupees, is a very minuscule capacity.
Yeah, it's not liquid. It's not... Yeah.
Right. So, when solar sort of went utility scale in 2012, the tariff was about 15 rupees. So on the one hand, you've had capacity rising and tariffs falling. And by the way, it could never happen any other way, because at the end of the day, there's a seller and a buyer. So there's no way on earth that we would have hit 21 gigawatt utility scale without the tariff being 2.5. Now you could argue 2.5, 260, 270, that's a separate matter. But it had to fall to this level for scale to go up. As I was saying earlier, PPAs themselves have evolved in terms of strength, in terms of contractual strength. In terms of design, I think there's going to be further evolutions. Not to say that current PPAs will be violated or should be, but the bigger the scale you want, the more interesting, the more flexible, the more fancy, for lack of a better word, your PPAs have to be. I mean, the first PPAs for Gujarat were literally at 15, 20 pages. It was nothing. Current PPAs are much more elaborate, offer bigger protections, envisage potential scenarios which need to get mitigated. And to get back to your question in terms of on the specific, in terms of certain states not really looking to sign RE, I don't think it's that they don't like RE. It would be fine. I mean, that would hold good if they were actually happily signing PPAs for coal and gas. I don't think they're doing either. Maybe they're just full up. So maybe they're just full up, right?
Well, there's that quote-unquote overhang, which we, tore apart in the earlier discussion.
So clearly there is a certain percentage, whether you call it share of installed capacity or share of generation, beyond which, without storage, renewables doesn't really work. The fact is, in India, share of generation, and renewables for today's discussion is solar and wind, which is intermittent.
Variable.
Variable, yeah. So today's solar and wind, as you mentioned, is less than 7% odd of generation, and that's at a national level. There are certain states in the south, maybe in the east, which are much higher, and maybe those are the very states where they've hit sort of a ceiling in terms of being able to absorb more and more renewable energy.
Give it 1 year of technology, and that ceiling will immediately jump another 50%. Let me jump in there on Tesla. So South Australia introduced the Tesla battery. It was a $100 million investment. It was 100 megawatts, biggest utility scale battery in the world, 129 megawatt hours, and it delivered a 50% return to the shareholders on that project in its first year, right? So phenomenally successful investment. I would argue it's a phenomenally successful investment for the community, because the thing it did was halve the cost of grid stabilisation in South Australia immediately. Because the gaming of the system, the grid stabilisation, is a value service. So when we talk about adding renewable energy and storage, there are other values in storage. There's grid stabilisation, and ancillary services are of value to the grid.
Yeah.
So I would throw that out there, because what a lot of Australian PPAs are doing, and India's exploring it, is saying from now on, the next PPA, first PPAs, we've got to honour them, they're contracts, they're agreed, investors took that legal risk. The next PPA has to have maybe 100 megawatts of solar and 10 megs of battery. So
we are experimenting with things like that, but
hybrids.
I think that there is so I completely agree with Gagan that there is sort of a learning curve of the regulatory environment as well, right? And one of the things that we've seen shift is, like you said, Gujarat and Maharashtra before, with their must-run clause in the PPAs, it made perfect sense. Renewables was such a fringe player that they should have been given that status. But moving on now, where we have deemed generation and we're very soon going to see a trial by fire of our existing PPAs on the change in law clause with the safeguard duty coming in. So that being said, the PPA itself is getting better. I think that we still have a long way to go in building capacity on adjudicating PPAs or when they're being contested. We don't do that fast enough, and there is, as a result of that, several sort of the business angle of a lot of these developers can be hurt. But one of the things that I find very astounding on why PPAs are not being signed at anything above 2.5 rupees is that we're actually violating the very principle that brought us here. What brought us to 2.5 what we got right off the bat was the reverse auctions. And the whole principle of reverse auction was you would be able to do price discovery given the conditions on the ground. When you artificially cap that at 2.5, it doesn't, I don't understand what is the logic, and what is 2.5 in Rajasthan is not the same as 2.5 in West Bengal, is not the same as 2.5 in Chhattisgarh, right? Mm-hmm. And this national level policy of we are only going to do 2.5 rupees actually then says that, especially for ISTS projects, that you are then only going to go to states which are already quite congested. And so, if what Tim is recommending is maybe still a little way off in the future, where we also have to sync that to some demand side management and a lot of sensitization of the end consumer, etc., which is something we need to do more on. In energy in India, we seem to only put supply side effort, and we don't do enough on the demand side. But that being said, the incremental thing that we can do right away is that you need to be able to go back to a world where you did price discovery differently for different states, and you sort of incentivize new capacity to come up in states that are actually perhaps less efficient in absolute terms, but in comparative terms, renewable energy in those states or in those sites would go a long way in terms of the economy-wide costs of transmission networks, etc., and the infrastructure costs that you would have to bear to integrate all of that. And that's the kind of strategic thinking that we need. And we didn't need this in 2014 or in 2015 when we had the first RE Invest, right? We were very happy to announce targets, and when the market responded in a way that even sort of superseded what the government expected, we were like, oh, that's it, our job is done. But it really gets interesting now. It's now is when we need to do these innovations and these nips and tucks. And nips and tucks that will need a sunset clause. This is not like, it's not like what I announce now will remain till the end of time.
He's out of battery. Yeah. So, but isn't that exactly the issue? Precedent plays sometimes such a negative role that once 2.44 was discovered, it just set such a mind space that anything more than 2.5 was deemed to be, there's something wrong. There's either a cartel or you're making stuff up or usury returns, which is clearly not what's going on. These are the realities of the underlying market. So in closing this sort of thread, unless there's other points, we have several other
Can I
topics.
jump in with one thread?
Yeah, sure. Just, I mean, one of the things I did take away was from a market design perspective and tariff structures, and clearly the next homework that needs to be done is not in the RE per se, and PPAs are one aspect that are improving. It's in the non-RE aspect of the rest of the system where a lot more of the effort needs to go. I think if I'm summarizing this part. So
I agree entirely with you. The idea of capping a reverse auction tender is just ludicrous. It's cutting off your nose, just on your face. It's ridiculous. 2.5 or 3, irrespective of that, in that range, even 3.2, it's still dramatically cheaper than a lot of coal-fired power. So why do it when you actually, as you point out, the critical thing financial markets need is risk analysis. And the risk analysis in one state is completely different to the risk analysis in another state. So you asked earlier the question about is the required rate of return on a solar project the same as a thermal project? International experience says categorically not. And the reason, what I would say is that a renewable energy infrastructure project, and India actually is seeing this now, you have financial institutions willing to lend to renewable energy infrastructure projects. They are absolutely closed to lending to thermal power because they've got so many assets on their book. Internationally, effectively, renewable energy infrastructure assets sit halfway between a bond and an equity. A bond internationally is 3%, equity returns are 10%, infrastructure returns are about 7%. The risk profile is halfway between, the return profile is halfway between. So
if I believed you, then after the foreign exchange hedge, you're at 12 or 13, if it was a pure hedge. I mean, so this is one of those issues that India's grappled with.
Sorry, that's the return on equity.
Yes. Yeah.
But you're going to be putting a 12
Okay.
or a 13% return on a thermal power plant because at some point, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, there will be a price on pollution, there will be a price on carbon, there will be a price on water, and you've got a 40-year plant life. So at some point, the banks will say, I'm going to factor in those externalities. They're not policy today, they're not policy in the next 5 years, but we have a 40-year life project. I'm going to put an ROE of 13% on that plant.
And just to sort of add to that point, I think it's useful to move away from the concept of absolute targeted returns, even though they are different for thermal and renewable, to think about spread over cost of debt. Because the cost of debt or the spread that banks charge over their base rates itself is coming down. And secondly, one of the things which hasn't really made enough press in India is over the last year, I'd say over the last 6 months or so, term loans for solar projects as well as wind projects are moving into A-rated category, A-rated territory. So the moment they move to AA, it opens up the bond market. And once you open up the bond market, you're actually talking about saving about 200 basis points. Yes, absolutely. So, and the domestic bond market is smaller than the equity market, but that's because of there's demand side issues as well as supply side. There's not enough AA scripts out there. But if this sort of renewable project wall of demand shows up there, there's a ready market that likes at 7.5%, 8%. And that's a big saving over what these projects are expected to pay today.
But that's only the debt side.
That's the debt side.
Yeah.
So imagine if I have a financial model in Excel today that says 10% equity IRR at a 9% cost of debt or 9.5% cost of debt. If that goes down to 8, my post-tax equity IRR probably goes up to 11.5 and 12%. So the spread has actually magically increased to about
Leveraging, yeah.
3.5, 4%. And at the end of the day, I think we must recognize that this is a business with very low barriers to entry. I mean, anybody sitting anywhere in the world can enter the Indian market in the span of 3-4 months. I mean, literally half the people in this room is what's required to set up a utility
And
scale.
solar parks make that even easier.
Absolutely. So when you talk about the risk on one hand, zero barriers to entry on the other, when you talk about capital that there are certain types of capital that likes this, not because it likes low returns, but it understands the risk.
Low return, low risk.
Yeah,
There is a huge $1 trillion wave.
Absolutely.
Of
So it's a bit of a
But it's
myth.
not, sorry, is it just the AA? Because, well, as you mentioned, the bond market in India is not that mature. You don't have the same turnover rates.
Because
that you need.
banks, insurance companies are mandated to only invest in AA or above.
Yeah.
Or above. So if I'm a bond issuer, if I go with a B, and I know that 3/4 of the market is shut to me, I won't even bother going to the bond market.
Sure. But is this only domestic? Because the holy grail from the Indian RE perspective has always been to attract the sovereign funds, the pension fund, global. So when Norway has a 1.5-ish% rate of return, that's the holy grail for tapping those sorts of funds. But I'm not sure they're ready to come into India. So what would it take? I mean, foreign exchange hedge is only one of them, and right now the
rating.
hedge cost. Sorry.
It's the rating. That's the only prohibitive factor. Whenever we get to AA, all of that opens up.
But is it just AA? Let's assume we got to AA, which is a matter of time by some measures. But foreign exchange hedge, right now that's
you buy
taking
it, but
away
there
the
are
all
facilities.
It's 6% plus.
Yeah, but if you're borrowing at 1.5, that's not so bad, no?
But then you're not too different from domestic debt either.
So clearly, yeah, you're right, because when you talk about foreign capital, I think what it is giving you a new pool of liquidity. It's not necessarily giving you a big cost saving.
Yeah.
I would say it gives you both, because the point you're making is the cost of that hedge is 6%. What should it be? Piyush Goyal actually said 2 years ago.
I was there.
3%.
I was
and he's
there.
right.
Yes. Well, not necessarily.
You bring in $100 billion.
No.
Well, let the
His
financial markets
his
develop a
assumptions
product.
on currency fluctuations are way off, and we've seen that actually in the last 18 months. So I don't think he'd make the same point today. And those people, the people who have hedged based on what he anticipated, are in trouble.
Or if they've hedged, they're not. It's because they've used financial markets. My point would be that the 6% annual cost is exceptionally high by global standards, and the reason it's exceptionally high is the market is not developed. You bring a whole lot
If
of
that were the
liquidity.
case, then there's scope. But if that's what the equilibrium says it needs to be,
You bring $1
especially
billion
with
of foreign capital, and you bring $100 billion, you bring $1 trillion of capital over the next 15 years, which is what India can deploy and what India needs. You're going to develop the market.
So I mean, one of the things I'm hearing is, well, once we fix these larger structural issues that really unleash the global capital, which is well beyond the RE story, then of course a lot of things will open up and ease out. But we can't put that on the backs of RE, and that's not going to drive that beast. Is
275 gigs of renewables is $275 billion. At 150, 200 billion of grid investment, by 2027, you're talking $500 billion. That's a market the global capital markets will play.
But their ability to change the problems with the hedge risks, for example, is determined by issues of capital accounts and a bunch of other things than just in this sector, is one sort of.
Actually, the more interesting finance flows question to my mind is, where are those $200 billion for grid infrastructure upgradation going to come from? I mean, the learning curve for large scale RE is we're sort of at the on the up. But who is paying for, except public money? Where is the private capital for upgrading grid infrastructure?
And in fact, to piggyback on that question, at RE Invest, one of the points flagged was on the transmission side, which is you get your construction of a solar park, or especially medium-sized solar park. So the new wave is not rooftop versus 1,000 megawatt, but it's actually 50, 100, 200 range that are probably going to fly much more because they don't have the cloud cover risk that you have with these mega parks. those can come up in 9 to 12 months. Your transmission's not going to come up in that same time frame. And so there is a serious both planning and operational disconnect, but also the financing disconnect that you're flagging. I mean, is that going to be a bottleneck to the Indian RE story, perhaps?
So, I mean, I think
Financing hat, putting on the financing.
So I think, it's useful. I mean, I think you're making the distinction between utility scale and, say, rooftop for a minute. I think the rooftop market has been not fully exploited because of an excessive focus on tackling it almost like a utility scale project. So I meet people who are talking about raising project finance for 1 megawatt size rooftop projects. It's incredible. So I think the real opportunity in rooftop is to differentiate between largish rooftop, which is put on commercial establishments, which may be that 1 megawatt or a bit smaller, and rooftop for residential applications. Now, rooftop for residential to me is a fast-moving consumer durable, much like a motorcycle, much like something in that price point, $1.5 lakh. And for that to happen, you have to have, and putting aside what's happening in the NBFC market for a minute, you need to have a product, you need to have standardization, and you need to have NBFC type financing. That's what's going to drive.
And a secondary market, right?
I'm sorry?
And a secondary market.
And maybe a secondary market, yeah, and which again is a challenge. But product standardization, secondary market, NBFC.
Well, I mean, so you've actually segued very nicely to our next set of questions that
I saw
shared.
that.
Is really this whole story. Absolutely, my job is easy when we've got a great panel. The so-called rooftop, let's not, I mean, it's just a label, but it's the non-mega grid scale and more distributed. Couple of immediate sort of worries or concerns. Forget the fact that we're way behind target for multiple reasons. 2 or 3 sort of threads that come up in what's wrong or what do we need to focus our effort and policy on. One is this on the backs of the utilities? So this whole utility death spiral sort of risk, that it's your paying customers are the ones who exit, and therefore there's these challenges. At one level, you're saying that cross-subsidy surcharges have been the way to handle exits, which open access had, as per the 2003 Electricity Act. Renewables were given a carve-out. They were actually exempt from this, and in theory, all cross-subsidy surcharges are supposed to go away if the amendments to the Electricity Act sort of happen. So now, is this a distortion that breaks the underlying system is one worry. Second worry is on performance. So I've talked to utilities that have distributed RE programs. I won't name them or their location, but they're finding in some cases 13% PLFs. So clearly, your PLF of a rooftop will not match a good grid scale, which will by definition be chosen in good locations. So that hits your financing, that hits your scope in the short run till prices fall. But the point is it's a little further away. And then of course you've got the whole issue of grid I mean, there's still a permitting, manpower, training. I mean, even specs on net meter differ across all these states. So there's a lot of other stuff that hasn't been sorted out. And you're right, we've treated it in one lens, and we need probably different lenses to enable this market. I like that analogy.
So just before,
like a mini, we've just treated it like a grid scale.
Correct.
Then your due diligence cost is going to wipe you out.
correct, yeah, and you'll never be able to develop scale at that rate. But just to sort of add one point here, you may be running at 13% PLF, but what you're competing is with your meter cost, right? That's $7 or whatever it is.
Which is keeping the system afloat because there is a cross subsidy there. So it's high, not because it's inherently high, but because you're paying for maybe
Fair
things
enough.
you need
So
not pay for.
But in
that's
the residential category, you're often the subsidized.
Not the guys. So this is an interesting open question. The highest slab of residential is usually where this stuff starts. Am I correct in that
Yes,
assumption?
of course.
So then these are guys
Anyone
7 plus. No, so these are guys at 7 plus.
Right. So that's, yeah, you're absolutely right. But firstly, think about if we are talking about scale, right? We're thinking about a rooftop market of 40 gigawatt, and that's a 2022 target we're going to miss. Never mind all that. But just think about within that residential rooftop, it has to be sizable, right? CNI the economics of it are compelling, but if you do captive CNI, it doesn't technically fall into the 40 gigawatt because that is all grid interactive. So if you were to imagine, say, that there's a 20 gigawatt residential rooftop market, and this is arbitrary, I made it up. In order to get there, there's not enough high-paying residential consumers. I mean, given load profiles, given location, etc. And then often they'll do it as captive or through net metering. So really, what is it that how do you get utilities to reform their value proposition so that they can offer business models actually to the sub 400 unit per month consumers? So the most subsidized. How does the utility make money by offering solar rooftops is by if they save their cross subsidy.
But that's, yeah. But
And there is an economic case to do this. I mean, at CW, we are recently obsessed with business models for residential solar rooftop, and there is a business case where your lowest paying residential consumer will still be better off if he or she had a solar rooftop.
But not based alone on their tariff structure because they're a lower slab. So it needs the utility.
And they're very small scale.
Yeah, but if the so one few issues that Gagan had sort of highlighted, it's disaggregated. Each unit needs very little money, cost of due diligence, transaction cost, etc. In this case, the borrower doesn't actually have a credit score at all, and if you were to calculate it, it would probably not be very good. In the absence of a secondary market, the panel itself isn't really worth very much. And so actually sometimes to raise a residential rooftop loan, the bank will ask you to put your entire house as mortgage. So for a 5 lakh loan, you need to put a 2 crore house as mortgage. It's unlikely to happen, and that's one of the reasons it hasn't taken off. But if the utility acted as an intermediary, the utilities aren't always the most creditworthy players either, and we've discussed that in some detail. But if they, based on your bill repayment history, acted almost as provided a proxy credit score, you'd be able to just get access to capital at a much lower rate. The bank doesn't have to do due diligence, and the utility can then charge you a little sort of service fee, and everybody wins.
So, I mean, is this feeding into the RESCO model? The versions of the Renewable Energy Service Company. But that's exactly the challenge. What's in it for the DISCOM to take on that risk? Because A, there's their own risk of the DISCOM itself, but B, they really have their hands full and don't necessarily want to get into this other activity, perhaps. So,
They have to, though, Rahul. They're
it's a debate.
hemorrhaging. Like you said,
Yeah.
they're losing their best customers first.
Yeah. So to
And
quote,
I think what Kanika is making a good point in that if the writing is on the wall for the discoms, they are going to lose their best customers. Why not give them a piece of the action, right? Somehow bring them in and say, take with one hand, give with the other. Now, how you structure it, how you model it is a separate matter. But that's the philosophy, I think, behind what she's talking about. And that's a sensible way of looking at it.
Can I give an example in Australia? Let's just rephrase the debate. Let's assume that the DISCOM wanted to solve the problem. Right? Now, why would they want to solve the problem? They're hemorrhaging cash, they're losing their better customers, but I'll put it a different way. The biggest problem we were just talking about was how grid congestion and handling all this variable renewables is going to stop India's energy transformation because the grid can't handle it, right? In Australia, one of our grid utilities said, let's actually put it in a different way. We've got demand growing in a certain region. We've got demand declining in other regions. We don't want a whole lot of solar in the demand declining regions, but we have spare capacity. We will have to upgrade the grid to accommodate increased demand over here. Let's, instead of spending our capital, we're going to get our customers to put in rooftop solar. And that's exactly what the grid operator did. They said, we don't want it here, we want it there. You go and put in as much solar as you like, we're going to limit it, we only want 20,000 systems. And they immediately got the 20,000. In fact, what our Ausgrid went and did was, in fact, incentivized. He said, we'll pay you $1,000 to put rooftop solar in here, because they worked out they had to put in new submeters, and those submeters cost $2 million. They said it's easier to pay a customer $1,000, do it 100 times or 1,000 times, than spend $2 million putting in a substation. Now, India has plenty of grid congestion. You also don't have a whole lot of rooftop solar across 1.4 billion people. I'm sure if you actually analysed the grid, you could find a few spots that could handle a bit of extra variable renewables. So put it in there, save the capital, because one thing I would remind you of, your demand for electricity is going to double in the next decade. You're going to have to double your capital spend on the grid, or you're going to have to spend it wisely. In other words, use technology to identify the areas where you can put in more variable renewable and then do it. Maybe you then put in a battery. Maybe you put some wind in. Maybe you put some offshore wind in, and maybe you spread the variable load. In other words, let's actually use the technology and the innovation that's going to come to actually save the DISCOM's capital.
I mean, absolutely. So one of the sort of takeaways from this segment is really been, we can't sort of ignore the DISCOM. They're a key participant as well. And we have to figure out business models that create the alignment between the incentive structures. And that alignment does require that granularity, which is where the technology would also play in. So if you're reducing local congestion or providing reactive power. So this is another area where some of us have written about, which is standards. This whole issue of standards, whether it's on the net metering was the first one, but even on the inverter, there has been very little discussion on smart inverters and their requirement. And if you look at the experience of Germany versus Hawaii, you really don't want to be retrofitting. It's just a very expensive and painful proposition. So since we're so small in our base, we should really be forward-looking in our design, except there's a cost to do it. And there's also a higher cost because of our annoyingly high cost of capital. So because I don't want to put my 2 crore house on I don't have one, but if I did, I wouldn't want to put that for a bank loan. People are actually treating implicit costs of capital not at 10%, 12%, but 15+% when it's a household really looking at it. And that really changes what your design, what your tech that you're going to do can operate.
But 15% isn't, in my view, always a problem. You do enough at that 15%, and that 15 will sort of inch downwards on
over
its
time.
own. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
If access to capital is in some ways more of, or is sort of a higher jump than the affordability,
It's a bigger,
it gets
you need to
easy.
get the capital first before you can
Exactly.
actually figure out
And
how
then they
to,
become
ways to get it cheaper.
competitive, and
Right?
it gets fun.
Yeah.
So today, if I'm a rooftop, well, let's say I'm a house. Sorry, yeah. If I'm a householder, I own a house, and I want to put some sort of solar contraption on my roof. Frankly, I don't know who to call, right? I don't know who to call. So I don't know who to call. I don't even care about cost of funding it. That's my secondary problem. Who do I call? Then I'll figure out how do I get it funded, and that's when I sort of figure out at what price I'm going to get funding. Right now, it's the first 2, which is the bigger hurdle in India when it comes to rooftop, then the actual cost of it itself. And getting to cost, I think it's easy to forget, but it's important to remember that Indian inflation rates determine monetary policy, and the starting point is the repo rate that the RBI sets. That's 6.25%. That's a fact of life. I mean, there's no way you're going to have anybody put money into India, because the moment you put money into an Indian balance sheet, it comes into India in the form of rupees. And to imagine that anybody is going to be willing to accept a rupee return with the inflation risk on the one hand, as it is, that's going to be less than 6, less than 7, less than 8, so on. It's just not good. So that's okay. I mean, as long as people recognize it.
It's
right?
not 12, which it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So it's there's a fair bit of confusion in terms of what can be done, and which is very different from what is achievable.
So is there then, let's assume, and I agree that the scope is higher than what we've achieved. So we have to figure out what's holding it back. But now I'm going to flip it the other way and ask, be careful what you wish for, which is, from a DISCOM perspective, the same issue. Until we solve these issues that you said, we need better models of engagement with customers. In the current rate of return, semi-monopolistic, etc., sort of cost-plus utilities that we have, just like the 2003 Electricity Act said, here's open access. Everybody over 1 megawatt is allowed to go for open access. And if you add up how many percentage of units consumed would have qualified, it's a very large number. It's, I think, 35 plus or some very large number percentage. The actual amount that's going under open access is trivial compared to it. Partly because of this utility resistance that's both overt and covert, whether it's permitting, whether it's a bunch of stuff. And there are anecdotal stories of the same thing happening in the RE space today. And so the faster that wall comes, the more we need to fix something at a systemic level. Otherwise, you're going to hit that wall pretty hard, is my sort of concern.
Quick point, actually, you used a word and that triggered a thought. In my view, one of the biggest challenges that the renewable energy sector faces in India is that we rely far too much on anecdotal evidence. And the thing is the sector is young, but the sector is not small. And we cannot any longer just say, oh, because I have the ear of the minister or of somebody, and then, policy will be made for me, and then I'm going to scream from the rooftops to say this is all unsustainable, and then tomorrow go and bid lower. It's clearly not working. And we are sizable enough to be able to have better data available, and I know you discussed this earlier in the day as well. And the thing is, it's not, there is data, we can have a long discussion on disclosure, etc. But there is also on sort of an agreement on what is the truth. And there needs to be much more coherence. And that will actually change some of those risk spreads as well, because this perception of risk will come down as the information asymmetry comes down. And using sort of Mercom or other such very much as a straw person and not to beat up on them. But that business model is flawed. All of that data should not be proprietary. And all decisions, whether it's policymakers' decisions, whether it's investment decisions or business decisions, they all need to be based on evidence, not on anecdotes.
Absolutely. This is music to our ears because
Sorry, I realized I got quite worked up there.
Well, this is something close to a number of scholars' hearts because we've been asking for better data, whether it's on the finance and even things like curtailment, which is something that significantly impacts. So, coming back to the opening said, better PPAs and arbitration and this. I have the counter because when I talk to folks, the clause says there are all these arbitration that's possible when you don't get paid on time. Not a single developer enforces it because what's the point of fighting with the guy you're going to come back crawling to later on?
But okay, having said that, and Kanika made a good point about reality versus anecdotal, selective anecdotal stuff. The reality is we've had about 6+ years of utility scale in India, solar that is. We've had much more of wind. How much of the debt, bank loans that have gone to fund that have gone bad, have gone NPA? Zero. So, you have on the one hand all this headlines grabbed by there's an impending sort of NPA crisis looming. On the other hand, you have billions of dollars of thermal loans that have gone bad. And yet the public discourse is focused on solar loans going bad. The reality is if a 15 rupee tariff is not being curtailed enough for a loan to go NPA, I really doubt a 2.5 rupee tariff will be curtailed enough. So second point before Kanika counters that is that even the 2.5 rupee tariff projects have gone operational. They've achieved financial closure. That's point number 2. And third point is I think you talked about people on the one hand expressing concerns about low tariffs, on the other hand bidding. I think the developers have actually not done themselves any favors by doing that.
Yes, exactly.
Not only from that perspective, but from the perspective of raising new money. So, if you're a developer and you come to me and you're the guy who said, well, the selling price of what I produce is too low. And then you say, well, by the way, I need $100 million. So I think that's really not going to work. And that really hasn't. You've seen primary IPOs fail or get scuttled. You've seen deeply discounted secondary offerings. So there's a difference between how a solar or renewable SPV is run, and that's pretty much cookie cutter today, versus how to raise growth capital at a whole level. That's the magic sauce out there is still being worked out.
So, we've already done some summaries of some of the issues in the distributed sector, and in some ways it's a much more complex story with more moving parts even than the grid scale, because in some ways everything that applies to the grid scale, from the macro, mega, global, the imports, and some others, applies to the rooftop, plus more stakeholders and players. So we have time for a little bit of question and answer. So Abhishek, we have people who are online. We're going to give them first priority. If there are, you can just ask that, folks online, if there's a mechanism to ask questions in the comments. Oh, but they may not have known, so I'm letting them know, and we'll try and keep an eye out to draw them in as well. And if I could request, I'll choose the questions. I mean, we'll keep it moving. A number of hands went up even in the earlier part, so we'll try and go in order. If you could briefly just mention who you are, and if it's addressed to any particular speaker. Do we have some? Can we give back one or two mics? Yeah. Oh, we have mics. Yeah. Sir. One second. Sorry. Just. Yeah.
It was a very nice discussion.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to bring it close. Yes. Thank
Yeah. The first thing you started with this levelized cost of electricity, solar. So, has any study been done in the Indian context? So we're talking about international experience and other places, even in Australia, but I don't think any single study has been done here, because we are not aware of this.
System level?
Yeah, system level cost. And even this 2 rupees 50 paisa or 3 rupees, whatever it is, it's a distorted sort of thing. And this was acknowledged by the minister also, present minister. So the real problem lies there. There are some reasons for curtailment also, what I see, because we also operate solar projects, and we find there's a lot of curtailment. There are other reasons. The other part of this, it is not being successful because of the requirement for your balancing power. So of late, this thing was not being realized. And unfortunately in India, that has to come from coal only. Even the demand, what we are talking about, it's a distorted sort of thing. It's not actual demand, but whatever supply that is being met, whatever, it's not even the requirement, because it's a suppressed demand. Because many people, they really need electricity, but they don't have access to the electricity because of supply, distribution, whatever. There are a lot of other reasons for that. So if you see, we have done some studies, and in fact we have started doing it from the generators perspective, like what would be the cost of electricity for different level of, for different flexible modes, like say in the evening. And another thing in India, there's a lot of variation between your afternoon and your evening peaks. There are 2 peaks in India, in the morning and other in the evening. Evening peak stays on for around 3 hours.
3 hours.
Yeah, 3 hours. And the gap is more than 100 gigawatt, 110 gigawatt. And only a part of it can be met by hydro, and that too in 2 months in a year. Even hydro, because there's a lot of spillage. And there are some other requirement that is from the irrigation and other parts. So that is a priority. Gas, we have very limited supply. Again, there fertilizer is a priority. So gas also is an issue. So most of it, out of 110 gigawatt, say around 90 minimum has to come from coal. So with a capacity of around 300, with a coal capacity I'm talking about, 320 gigawatt. Operating in the afternoon, it will be only 33 gigawatt if there is a solar power. Again, in the evening, it will be say 120.
Today it was 120.
Yeah, 20, yeah.
120.
So that is a cost.
Yesterday.
And this is happening because of the solar or for the RE. So who will bear that cost? Should we socialize that cost? Those answers has to come.
So I think,
Yeah.
The
question, the question started with this. I was just, it was a continuation of that question. So what is that levelized cost of electricity?
You mean system level?
Yeah, system level.
System level.
Yeah,
so,
those are the components I was talking about.
Sure. So, I mean, it has to look at the ramping, the balancing, the transmission,
Congestion charges.
congestion, all of these.
Yeah.
So, I think there haven't been enough studies, certainly, and I don't think any of us could answer. Sorry? Yes.
I would actually say every time we see a bid and we see $10 billion of capital put on the table, that's actually corporates bidding $10 billion. That's a pretty serious estimate of what the levelized cost of energy is, because they're actually doing that. Otherwise, you're saying they're idiots. Like,
No, they're
bidding-
relying on PPAs. I wouldn't, but that's not system-wide, because a PPA is a very narrow LCOE, narrower
there is
generator
no
cost.
system cost because it depends.
Sorry, just one, because we're on. Yeah.
The 244 or the 250 is sort of an artificial price, right? In what way and why do you think so? Since you clearly sort of, you think about this deeply both from the coal and the solar side.
Yeah, see, this is standalone solar, and in the 2 rupees 50 paisa on the land, it was free, almost free. Land cost, if you are to put up a large, say, solar park or.
They pay very high land charges, sir, more than if you were outside of a solar park. So, for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, if you were in a solar park, say in a Rewa solar park, versus if you basically bought the land right next to it, inside the solar park is more expensive, just land cost. So it's not free.
It varies by location, but also it's taken care of. So there is a logistics saving to you, which has value. Land acquisition.
And other things, you assume a particular PLF. And in India, it's a different environment, lot of dusty environment. Every time we cleaning, there's a cost also. You have to take it down. Again, you have to have a cleaning cycle or to install some robotic cleaning. So that is also a cost. So some of these costs they were ignored even in the project.
So you're saying that these businesses are then unsustainable?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. Just information about what is the actual cost. What is the actual
But
cost?
that's on the
Of a
developer.
solar electron or of a unit of electricity in the power system. They're two different things.
Yeah, unit of electricity into the power system.
Yeah, so that I agree
That is
that we-
levelized system level cost.
Correct. But the levelized cost of electricity,
system
244
level,
is
right.
not an
Sure,
artificial
because
number,
CEA
right?
has one of the few studies which was limited to 2 states, Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, and that found a system level add-on at that point in time under a bunch of assumptions of approaching 1.5 rupees additional, 1.5 extra was the, but it clearly needs more transparency and more data to understand at the national level and the trends, because all of these are going to change over time.
I
Sorry,
think
we
there
have-
should also be a database of all the PPAs that have been executed, right? Not just for solar, but also for thermal.
No, sir, we'd like to get... No, sir, if we could please allow the ones who had their hands first, sorry. Okay, here and then Rohit, yeah.
The mic.
Yes, you have the mic, so... Yes.
I'm Manu from Council on Energy, Environment and Water, works with Kanika. My question is on interest rate cycle. I think Gagan mentioned it. How big does the panel, and especially you think, interest rate cycle, interest rate risk is a sort of risk to the renewable energy projects? Especially we know that in the US and in India, these interest rate hikes sort of being unexpected. So,
I mean, certainly, I think we are looking at the end of an easy monetary policy globally, not just in India. Bank loans tend to be floating in the sense that raises in base rates, which flow from a raise in repo rate, let's say policy rate, MCLR today, get passed on to the borrower. So clearly, it's a risk. Now, if you can access the bond market, what that means is you can bypass that risk because you're looking at a fixed rate for a certain term. So clearly, it's a risk not just for solar, but higher interest rates are a risk for any infrastructure, right? So it's a risk, but it's not a solar-specific risk to one. It's not a renewable specific risk. And on the other hand, the mitigant, which is an potential access to bond market, which I think is very nearby, is actually a mitigant which is not available to other infrastructure, by and large, at least to other energy infrastructure. So you have to look at it from that. On the downside is applicable to everybody, but the upside, the silver lining, is potentially only available to renewables.
Hi, I'm Rohit Chandra. I'm an independent researcher. So for Gagan, do you think and anyone else can answer it as well, do you think the era of state financing of big power infrastructure is over in some senses, given all the NPAs that are happening right now, given a lot of the private money that's flowing into solar? You know, there's this convenient separation that seems to be happening. The state has invested in all the legacy infrastructure, and the private sector will be investing in solar going forward. It's a convenient narrative. I don't know if it's true. I'd love anyone's views, but particularly yours on this.
So, insofar as thermal was financed from, at least on the debt side, let's say, by PSU banks, and that's kind of...
Or
I think,
NBFC, like
or
REC,
NBFC, yes,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So
And almost entirely. I mean, even
Right.
the 20% equity was,
Right.
refinanced in various ways.
So insofar that's concerned, I think clearly the market has to be... it can't be limited to those sources of financing. Whether it's because they don't have the appetite and all is a separate matter. Secondly, I think the banking market is going to be a source of primary project finance for a long time to come, because the bond market typically in India, a bit less so overseas, only likes execution risk mitigated projects.
Exactly.
So it's going to be the Indian banking sector. Which banks again is open is a separate matter.
But I mean, that almost by default means public sector banks, right? I mean, given
yeah.
their size.
Yeah, but then if you have these banks being able to, or if you have the bond market being able to refinance that and return this money to the banks, then it makes it easier for them to recycle. Because remember, today you have about $100 billion of Indian bank money exposed to the energy sector, exposed to electricity. So if you're talking about another 75 billion required in the next 4 years, both from a credit growth perspective as well as a sector concentration risk perspective, it's impossible to believe that the Indian banking system can pony up another 75 billion.
Exactly.
So clearly the banking system does not have the headroom by itself. Money, I think, is going to come from the domestic bond market. I think the foreign bond market, both as a source of primary lending to to project companies, as well as, remember, to lenders also, as well. So Indian lenders themselves on the liability side, they raise money overseas in the form of green bonds. You have Yes Bank, you have Radar, you have a bunch of institutions. So again, what they're doing is they're looking at bypassing, and rightly so, the Indian sources of building up their balance sheet, looking at foreign sources and on lending. So it's a mix of everything, but clearly the domestic bank market is not capable by itself to fund renewable energy.
Right, and PE seems to have been the convenient substitute for the short term, but do you think that's going to persist? Or, I mean, will mean like
Private equity.
private equity?
Private equity, I think, has come in more at the holdco level, not at a project SPV level. So at a project SPV level, to my knowledge, it's equity that comes in combined with debt. What's really going to happen, I think, is the InvIT market's going to take off. So the way I see it is you're going to have developers spin off their execution risk mitigated projects into InvITs. That InvIT, then how much the developer owns of that InvIT is a separate story. That InvIT, public capital that comes with the InvIT, gives the money back to developers. The developers recycle that, put it into new projects. That's a smarter thing to do, I think, than for a developer to have a portfolio of gigawatts and then access the public market directly. Because the public market then public investor gets pretty confused as to what he's investing in. Is it a developed portfolio? Is it development risk? What is it?
Thanks.
We had a question towards this side. We're well beyond our time frame, but any sort of closing thoughts or wish list if we're trying to sort of take this sector forward? We've identified a number of the hurdles or things that are round two. So round one was about the basics and getting us to where we are. Round two is not going to look like the same as round one. So any thoughts or suggestions or wish lists?
I think
Other than data, we've noted.
yeah, more focus on market design, and this is sort of not a renewables question, but just when we throw around words like competitive and parity and other things, that's actually it's difficult to actually use any of those words fairly in the existing market design and tariff structuring, and how tariff structures are actually at contrast with each other depending on fuel type. So I would say market design, improved regulation, and then a better sense of project level risk, which is not in the control of the developer. So like a better understanding of how much risk does the offtake really present.
And even better metrics for counterparty risk. Quite honestly, it's done in a very lumpy discom level, but it's not just that. There's other nuances that can vary. While on paper it looks similar, from their load profiles to their legacy to their contractual obligations outside the RE sector.
And also the ratings that are available today for discoms are not really ratings.
No.
They're not credit ratings, because a credit rating is a probability of or the likelihood of that entity being able to meet its financial obligations. So this, if you read the fine print, is a grading.
Mm-hmm.
And the way to describe it, it's a grading, or it's measurement of the operational and financial health. So again, there's a lot of good work that can be done in understanding the actual credit rating of these discoms.
So I know we know what the evaluation by Care is. It's a grading on multiple criteria, which includes cash coverage, but also a bunch of other stuff. So discoms were refinanced under Uday, for example. Was there no ratings available to make that decision? So how did that play out? I mean, so are you saying that no discoms have a investment style rating to their
Not
debt?
to my knowledge. So I think it was 4 years ago, was it, Kanika? Maybe you know better, when that first integrated, it was called a rating booklet that came out. Because remember, a discom rating is not just applicable to solar, it's applicable to... So that came out just 4 years ago, I think.
There have been several different iterations, 5-6 years ago.
It's updated every year.
Yeah, and they also say A plus, B plus. So it's actually quite confusing because it's rated quite similarly.
Yeah, but if you read the fine print, and I think it's
in
page 19 of the whatever edition, if I remember correctly, it says in the footnote, it's actually not a rating.
Yeah.
It says it's a grading, So,
So then we have
which
rating
we've been using
agents.
as proxies.
Correct.
which the public uses as a proxy.
Well, we have rating agencies in the country, including ones that did this report.
Yeah.
So one other suggestion seems to be to get the ministries or somebody to pay for getting an actual true rating done for the discoms. Would that be of value?
I mean, I think that there'd be people who'd do it for free or be willing to pay. I would pay for it, I think. But would these
Utilities
discoms
share
open their books? So back to data.
Yeah.
Well, I might conclude on a slightly different point. That is that India is looking at an enormous opportunity. It's actually a really positive opportunity. It's a deflationary opportunity. And isn't it a horrible situation where India is looking at electricity costs of 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, zero indexation for the next 25 years, with every probability that it'll be 1.5 to 2 rupees in 10 years' time? Technology is changing. India has to build its grid, and it's going to double the grid in the next 10 years. That is a massive opportunity to invest in technologies of the future, build industries of the future, and be a world leader in a clean, sustainable energy system that's deflationary and that will drive economic growth sustainably for India. I think it's a lovely problem to have.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, and so we're reminded there's large scale and then there's Indian scale. So even niches in India are bigger than countries in Europe. So I think it's not going to be one size fits all. We're going to see a coexistence of different models hopefully evolve, and that'll take us towards our sustainability. And I don't think we're going to be driven by targets, because there have been different announcements. Only on paper the 175 exists. There are no official targets for other time periods. There have been verbal announcements, but there are no firm announcements. And I think the real challenge for India is not meeting targets or even having the targets, but enabling the frameworks that can unleash whatever can be born. So we've had a lot of food for thought, great discussion, and hope all of you can join us for some refreshments and continue the discussion outside. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.